But as far as what you were asking about climate change, I feel like, climate change is a reality, right? You can't deny climate change. But among today's capitalists, there are two viewpoints, right? You got the fracking companies. You got the small capitalists. And they're afraid that environmental regulations are going to cut into their profits. And so their attitude is, climate change isn't real, it's fake, it's something they made up to ruin my profits, a communist conspiracy. That's the lower levels, right? But then you have the higher levels of American capital and the higher levels of international corporations. They say, yes, climate change is a reality. And that means all these countries that are trying to raise themselves up out of poverty, they just can't do it, right? It'll be bad for the earth, guys. And you'll see this, right? And Obama, the speech he gave in Africa, where he told people in Africa that basically they should stay in poverty for the sake of the environment. That seems to be their attitude. But what's coming out of China and the socialist world right now, and that'll get to what you raised, their attitude toward the problem of climate change is the opposite. They say it doesn't mean that we should end development and end historical progress. That climate change proves the necessity of advancing technology beyond fossil fuels and making new breakthroughs that have never been made before. That climate change necessitates an alternative to fossil fuels. It necessitates fusion energy. It necessitates the space program, right? That the answer to climate change is to continue advancing faster than ever before. It's not a pessimistic view of the climate crisis. It is an optimistic view. It's an understanding that just like humans overcame the Black Death that they talked about in Europe, just like humans overcame, the scarcity that existed at the time of hunter-gatherer civilization, that this proves that with socialism and economic planning, we must advance, and that's the difference. And that's very similar to the BRICS. There's an alternative in global trade that's emerging right now. The way neoliberalism and Western trade works is the USA goes to an impoverished country and says, okay, we'll give you a loan to develop your country, but in order to do it, you need to privatize all your state-owned industries, right? And you need to stop subsidizing domestic corporations. So we'll give you this loan, and then you have to privatize, and pretty soon American companies come in there, and they put all the local manufacturers out of business, and the country's economy is basically looted, and they become a captive client state in exchange for getting a development loan that helps them keep the electricity on. What China does is the opposite. It goes to developing countries, and it says, okay, you could really use a power plant here. And it builds a huge hydroelectrical power plant. I've seen some of these hydroelectrical power plants built by China and Brazil. They go to a developing country and they say, wow, if you had a high-speed train connecting this part of the country to this part of the country, that would improve your economy. And this is not selfless. It's not charity. It's not. This is in China's interest, because the wealthier that country becomes, the more that China has to trade with, right? So that China makes more money, and this country makes more money, and it's win-win cooperation. It's an alternative model in global trade. Whereas what the United States does is it's zero sum. It comes in there and puts these countries out of business. What I think is very interesting is that during the period of industrial capitalism, as imperialism was starting to emerge, you saw some of the advocates of industrial capitalism advocating a similar model. Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, they had similar theories. They argued that the state should protect industrial capital, and they were arguing the United States should sponsor infrastructure projects in developing countries, and they had some theories that are similar to what China's putting out now, but it's not the same. But China's vision of global trade is countries getting wealthier together, right? Win-win cooperation. It's an alternative to the US model of global trade. And you'll notice that the response of the World Bank and the IMF is almost to admit that China is right in its criticism. They're throwing up their hands and saying, you know what, we were too neoliberal during the 1990s. We were too free market. We went too far. Oops, we screwed up. That's kind of their response. They don't even try to counter the narrative, because everyone saw what happened in Latin America during the 1990s. I went to Ecuador in the 1990s, 1999. I was 12 years old. I got off the plane. I had never seen that level of poverty. I mean, just crowds of starving people out in front of the airport. Desperate poverty. What had happened? Well, the USA and the IMF and the World Bank had forced Ecuador to give up its domestic currency and start using the dollar. They had privatized the land, and thousands of people from the countryside of Ecuador were being forced off their land and into the cities, and it was a dramatic, horrific thing. When I was in Venezuela, people talked to me about how during the 1990s, Venezuela would need a loan from these Western banks, and so to get their loan, they would say, okay, well, you need to lay off sanitation workers, right? You're spending too much money on sanitation workers. And so it would get to be that in certain parts of the capital city, the garbage wouldn't be collected for weeks, right? The electricity, they would say you have too much, you're spending too much money on your electrical system and your power plants. So it got to the point that the electrical system was just going off because the government didn't have the money. The Bolivarian movement in Venezuela traces its origins to an uprising that happened in response to a very dramatic increase in the cost of public transportation, the Caracazo. Neoliberalism was a nightmare in Latin America. It was also a nightmare in the former Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union, the shock therapy economic reforms that were imposed by Jeffrey Sachs, by George Soros on Eastern Europe were dramatic. I mean, the rate of suicide went through the roof, the rate of drug addiction went through the roof, all the factories were closing their doors, the agricultural system shut down, and they started having to import all their food from the United States and from Western Europe. Free market neoliberalism imposed on the world by the IMF and the World Bank was an economic disaster. They don't even try to pretend it wasn't, but it wasn't being done to raise these countries out of poverty. It wasn't like an experiment. It was being done to secure a monopoly for Western corporations. That's why it was being carried out. And it very effectively did that until in Russia you had the rise of Vladimir Putin, who created Gazprom and Rosneft and turned these two giant energy corporations into the basis of kind of a state-centered economy that could counter the West. And that was a very dramatic shift that happened when Putin got into office. But until then, I mean, we saw Eastern Europe being gutted, and much of Eastern Europe is still suffering under this. When George Bush invaded Iraq, he talked about the new Europe, right? He said that France and Germany, all the countries that didn't agree with him, they were the old Europe. They're the old Europe. There's this new Europe. There's Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia. And if you look at the new Europe countries, still, these countries have never recovered from the fall of the Soviet Union. They were gutted and economically destroyed by Western banks. And China's model of global trade is different. And people hear this and they let me repeat. I'm not saying that China is being selfless. This isn't the Soviet Union, sending aid to Africa. This is China working in its interest, but seeing its own economic interest in being this country raising up out of poverty. And what China is doing in terms of fossil fuels right now is amazing. China imports most of its oil. That's a weakness they have. That's why they're trying to control the South China Sea and make sure those oil tankers can continue to go through the South China Sea. They realize it's a weakness. So what China is doing in terms of forcing both domestic Chinese companies and international companies to build electric cars or new energy vehicles is really dramatic. They're changing the global car market like overnight. It's really, really dramatic. So that's really important what you raised.